Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is the President Abraham Lincoln Assassination, Conspirators, and John Wilkes Booth Escape Route live stream tour. Thanks so much for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. So this is actually the second part of a two-part program that we've done, and we do this actually every year on Abraham Lincoln. So if you missed part one, or if you want to watch it again, that particular program focused on the Lincoln assassination and really around the context of online or a virtual tour of Ford's Theater. We actually recorded that program if you missed it, or if you want to watch it again, and we're going to load it to our YouTube channel. We just have some editing work that we're doing to kind of clean up the video for that. So that should be done in the very near future, like in the next day or two. So keep posted for that. And this program, though, we're going to focus on the Lincoln assassination conspirators themselves and talk about how John Wilkes Booth tried to escape, but did not make it. And so that's the theme for tonight's program. So thanks so much for being here. So Abraham Lincoln was born February 12th of 1809, and he was killed on April 15th, 1865. Booth actually shot Lincoln on the evening of Friday, April 14th of 1865, and then Lincoln died from his injuries the following morning. So sometimes you'll see the dates go back and forth between April 14th and April 15th, and that's because Lincoln was shot on Friday evening, and he died the following Saturday morning. And so when I used to live in Washington, D.C., I used to give tours of not only Ford's Theater, but the area around Ford's Theater. And I'll do this at some point in time again in the near future if you want to join us in person. I split my time between the East Coast, like Washington, D.C. and New York, and where I currently live now in Texas. So I can't give the tour at the moment because I'm not in Washington, D.C., but I go back there frequently. And it's really interesting to visit these places like Ford's Theater and the surrounding neighborhood, because for myself, growing up in Detroit, Michigan, my hometown, I read a lot about the Lincoln assassination and Ford's Theater and the various other events and things that took place in that area. And so really interesting to go see it for yourself in person. So we'll do that at some point in time. Keep me on the lookout for that. And my name is Robert Kelleman. I'll be your host. A little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I was an art history major in college. And then I ended up moving away from Michigan, and I've lived the past many years in Southern California, and then Washington, D.C., and then now Texas. So that's a little bit about me. Hold on for 1 second. And so I thought I would do this online talk about the Lincoln assassination. I think more people focus on the assassination itself and don't know a lot about the conspirators, and then also how did John Wilkes Booth get caught? What happened to him? I think people know the basics of the story, but it has a lot of really fascinating details. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. So thanks for joining us. Hold on for 1 second while I tweak something on my computer. So just FYI, how I got interested in this topic in kind of a more extensive way was we have a history book discussion group. And way back in 2016, my friend Dave, he, as the history book discussion group, selected this book called Manhunt by James Swanson, who is a local Washington, D.C. based author. Now, I'd previously read and researched quite a bit about the Lincoln assassination. There's another excellent book about the topic by my friend Anthony Pitch called They Have Killed Papa Dead, The Road to Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln's Murder, and the Rage for Vengeance. So these are actually my two favorite books about the Lincoln assassination. There's obviously quite a few other really, really good ones, but I like the one by Anthony Pitch. He was a friend of mine. He ended up passing away, unfortunately, about a year ago. He also was a local Washington, D.C. author. And then in the book discussion group that we had, I think it was back in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, we were reading this book, Manhunt by James Swanson. And so this really prompted a discussion in our history book group, like, wow, this book was really cool and really fascinating. We should go out and actually visit these sites that they were talking about in the book. So that's what we ended up doing. We actually rented a van and we drove down there. So if you're not familiar with the geography of the Mid-Atlantic area, up here in Washington, D.C. is where Ford's Theater is, of course. And then Booth, in his attempt to escape, ends up traveling this route. He stops at Dr. Mudd's farm, most famously, and he travels along these other places. And then he's finally captured and shot and killed at Garrett Farm, which is in Virginia. So this is Washington, D.C. up here. And then this is Maryland over here, this area. And then on the other side of the river, this is Virginia. And so this is where Booth was captured. So we were talking about this in our book discussion group, like, hey, it'd really be cool to go check that out. So that's what we did. So we rented this van, and this picture was from several years ago, and we drove down there and we visited all these different sites. It's like a day trip if you want to go do this yourself. And so I thought what I would do is, if you are interested in going, this can be kind of like a precursor to your own trip, or if not, if you can't make it to the mid-Atlantic area, you can kind of see what it's like from afar. So that was kind of how I really got interested in learning about this topic in much more detail. And again, if you get a chance, really highly recommend these books. They've Killed Bob Ted by Anthony Pitch and Manhunt by James Swanson. And then you can go on your trip and learn all about. So this talk tonight will be focused on the things that you can see along that route. All right, so before we get into the actual spots you can see on the route, let's talk about some historical context really briefly. So John Wilkes Booth, the two or three things that people know about him: he was a famous actor, he shot and killed Lincoln, and then he himself was killed. But what are some other facets about his story? Well, he was born in 1838. He died in 1865. He was, of course, a famous actor. He was a Southern sympathizer. So he was born and raised in Maryland. And during the time leading up to and during the Civil War, a lot of people had mixed feelings, say, about the Union and the Civil War and stuff like that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So he was a Southern sympathizer. And in my opinion, he had very kind of extremist political views. We all have our own political views, but his were very extreme in terms of what he was interested in and what his thoughts were. And so that becomes problematic for him. He was a racist, for lack of a better word, or just to be blunt. And so he was not happy because Lincoln was talking about, after the end of the war, granting African-American citizenship, which would give them the right to vote, and various other things. And Booth was violently opposed to that. So that was problematic for Booth. And then he really blames Lincoln for all the suffering that the South experienced during the Civil War, all the misery and suffering that came about because of the Civil War. Booth really blames Lincoln for that. And so he ends up becoming the object of his frustration. And so he enlists other people that have kind of similar opinions and thoughts. And so this was the team of conspirators that Booth put together. These were people that he either encountered in Washington, D.C., or they were like friends of friends. And so while the war is going on, he's talking to these different individuals and kind of plotting different things that they can do to help the Southern cause. And the initial thought was that they would kidnap Lincoln, but they do actually do that. They end up assassinating him, at least Booth does, and then off he flees. And so it's really, again, fascinating to travel physically down these sites and see the Mary Surratt Tavern and the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, and et cetera, and then you can go all the way down to Garrett's Farm. And if you want to do this yourself, it's pretty easy to do. It requires pretty much a whole day, though, because it is a fair amount of driving from Washington, D.C. down to Garrett's Farm. And then, of course, you can stop at these sites along the way. So what I really recommend doing, if you want to do this on your own, is to get up early in the morning, start your day, and then off you go. Now, some people don't have time to go all the way down to Garrett's Farm if they're living in, say, the Washington, D.C. area. And if you just go to the Surratt Tavern or the home of Dr. Mudd, that's fine. That's better than nothing. But if you have the chance, the best thing to do is to be able to go make the whole entire trip. And so I'll walk through the things that you can see along this trip and kind of talk about some things to think about in terms of how they fit into the context of the events that took place, and then also maybe kind of give you a few suggestions if you end up wanting to visit on your own. So, of course, our story starts at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This is where Booth shot Lincoln. And again, this program, we don't really talk as much about the assassination. We did that in part 1. If you want to watch part 1 because you missed it when we had it a couple weeks ago, or if you want to see it again, we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel. We just have to clean up the video a little bit. So Booth shoots Lincoln. Now, a key thing that happens that really impacts the route that Booth takes after he shoots Lincoln and his eventual capture is the fact that when Booth shoots Lincoln, he has to then escape. This is the inside of Ford's Theater, of course. This is the presidential box. Lincoln is sitting right here. Booth sneaks up behind him, shoots him in the back of the head, and then Booth has to get away. And so his initial plan was he would jump over the edge of this balcony here, down onto the stage, run across the stage and out the back door of the theater where his horse would be waiting for him, and then he could ride his horse off to safety. Now, what happens though is there's a Union military man who is in the booth with Lincoln and Lincoln's wife, and then also this Major Henry Rathbone. And so after Booth shoots Lincoln, Rathbone and Booth get in a little bit of a tussle. I should say more of a little bit. It was an actual tussle. And Booth has a knife with him. He ends up stabbing Rathbone to get away from him. And then once he's taken care of him, so to speak, Booth jumps off of or out of the box down onto the stage. But in doing so, his spur, if you're not familiar with the spur, that's a metal device that's attached to your boots that you can use while you're horseback riding. His spur gets hung up on the American flag, and he falls awkwardly onto the stage. And it's also a pretty significant drop. It's 12 feet from here to here. And I visited Ford's Theater many, many times. And that's one thing that people really are, say, fascinated by. They look at this and like, wow, I knew he jumped out of the box, but I didn't know it was that far down to the stage. I mean, 12 feet, that's quite a distance. Now, Booth as an actor was known as being very athletic and very acrobatic. So he would have an advantage over just, say, a regular person. But that being said, it's still a long ways down. So when he jumps, he lands awkwardly on his leg, breaking a bone, and then it causes him issues from later on. So I put a star on this slide because this is really, really a key point in the series of events, the fact that he damaged or hurt himself when he did the jump. And then, if you're not familiar with the Washington, D.C. area, it's separated from Maryland by the Anacostia River. And so this is an aerial view. This is, of course, Washington, D.C. Ford's Theater is way back over here. And so Booth has to get out of Washington, D.C. after he shoots Lincoln. He has to get to Maryland because he's kind of boxed in, so to speak, when he's in Washington, D.C. And so you can actually visit this site. Now, this was a picture of a walk that we had several years ago. But this is a picture of the area in more recent times. So this is Washington, D.C. over here where these people are standing. And then this is the Anacostia River, which separates the two. And then you can see, well, they have this bridge, which connects the two land masses. Well, they didn't have the bridge back at that point in time. Well, they did have a bridge, but Booth has to get across the river. And so he's got to make arrangements to do that. And this is what the area looked like at the time of the Lincoln assassination. So this is the Washington, D.C. side, and it's looking across the river towards Maryland. And so Booth has to make it across this bridge. Now, the war was still going on, and during the time of the Civil War, this bridge was heavily guarded because the Union military is in control of the city and the surrounding area, and they were always worried that maybe some Confederates would try and attack the city or something like that. And just because there's a war going on, there's heightened security. So there's guards at both ends of the bridges. And so after Booth shoots Lincoln, he needs to get out of Washington, D.C. He approaches this spot and he's stopped by the guards. And now the protocol at this particular time was they would not let people pass over the bridge at night. And so Booth shoots Lincoln at about 10:15 in the evening. And so around 10:30, he rides on horseback and gets to this point, and he's like, okay, I have to get across the bridge now. And they're initially telling him that, well, you can't cross because you're past the deadline. I think the deadline was 9 o'clock p.m. It's too late at night. You're going to have to just wait until tomorrow morning. He obviously doesn't want to wait because he knows once people find out that Lincoln had been shot, the word gets out that people are going to be looking for him. There's going to be this manhunt for him. Now, at this point in time, because news travels much slower, the guards at the bridge don't realize that Lincoln has been shot. They don't think that really anything's going on. And plus, by this point in time, the war was winding down. The security maybe got a little bit more lax. And so Lincoln, killer, Booth, is talking to one of the guards that's monitoring the bridge and the traffic across the bridge. And eventually Booth is able to sweet talk his way across the bridge, which this is also a key point of the story, because how would things have turned out differently if they would not have let Booth across the bridge? He really didn't have a backup plan on what he was going to do. His whole entire plan actually was not really all that well thought out after he shot Lincoln. And we'll talk about that as well and how that ends up leading to his capture. But it really a big turning point in the story, because what would have happened had he not been able to cross the bridge? It's really interesting hypothetical. So then anyway, he does finally get across. And then shortly after Booth goes across the river, his accomplice, David Harold, who was involved in the attempted assassination of Secretary Seward, he also shows up at the bridge. Now, he wasn't quite a smooth talker as Booth, and so he had a harder time getting across the river. He essentially told the guard that he had come over from Maryland to DC to visit a lady friend, and that he was going back home, and that's why he was out so late at night. And so the guard kind of eventually felt sorry for him and let him cross. But so eventually you have Booth and Harold crossing the bridge, and their plan was to meet up on the Maryland side of the water. And so that's what they end up doing. So on the road from Washington, D.C. to the Surratt House, Booth encounters Harold on the road. They're both on horseback. It's really late at night on a Friday. There's not many people out and about. This is a very rural area, particularly way back then. So there's not really going to be that many people. So it was kind of interesting, though, the fact that they were able to meet up with one another, because if that had happened, that would have also changed the story quite a bit. And so as you're going on your travel, the first real kind of stop that you can go make is to the Surratt House, the Mary Surratt House in Clinton, Maryland. Now, Booth and Harold are familiar with Mary Surratt because Mary's son, John Surratt, was a friend of John Wilkes Booth. And so the initial plan was that Booth was going to kidnap Lincoln, and he was going to take him down this route to the Confederate States. So he was already familiar with this area and was kind of making plans to do that. And so he ends up meeting John Surratt, and he ends up meeting his mom, John Surratt's mom, Mary Surratt. And Mary Surratt, in addition to having a boarding house in Washington, D.C., which is just a few blocks from the Ford's Theater assassination site, she also had another boarding house in Maryland. So this is the one in Washington, D.C. We talked about this one in our previous program. This is where a lot of the planning took place of the Lincoln assassination. This is a recreation of what it would have looked like back during the Civil War. And then this was a photo from the early 1900s. It doesn't look like this anymore. It's actually been converted to a Chinese restaurant, but the building is still there and you can go visit it. It's pretty cool to check out. So anyway, Mary Surratt has this boarding house in Washington, D.C. And she also has another one, which is more of a tavern in Maryland. So this is called Surratt Tavern. And so sometimes people can get the two places mixed up, because she had the boarding house in Washington, D.C., the Mary Surratt boarding house in Washington, D.C., and there's also the Surratt Tavern in Maryland. So two different sites in two different places, but they were owned by the same woman. And so the thought was that Booth and his accomplices would rendezvous here after the assassination, and they could pick up more weapons and supplies. Booth, when he goes into Ford's Theater to shoot Lincoln, he has to travel very lightly. He doesn't want to have a bunch of stuff with him. So the thought being he would just take the bare minimum with him to shoot Lincoln, and then he would escape from Washington, D.C., and then rendezvous with the others at Surratt Tavern, and then he could pick up more supplies and get food and all that kind of stuff, and then go about his way. So that's what the plan is. And so if you're going to be making this trip yourself, you probably can go the same exact route. Now, if you're living in somewhere else, like maybe in Virginia, I guess you could always make the same trip, but in a reverse route. But we'll go through it, of course, in the way that Booth actually took it himself. And so here you go. So this is pretty close to Washington, D.C. It's not very far at all. So here's the map. Here's Ford's Theater. Here's the Surratt House. Now, this map screenshot was taken late at night. And so this is a pretty short drive, if it's as long as it's not rush hour. So if you were to try and make this drive in the evening, like Monday through Friday, it would probably take you a lot longer than 28 minutes, because as great as Washington, D.C. is as a city, the traffic in the area can be really, really challenging. So anyway, but it's not very far at all, but it really is just a 30-minute drive if you're going by car. Now imagine though, Booth is traveling by horse, and he also has a broken leg. And so his trip took him quite a few hours. It took him quite a bit longer to get to the Surratt House. But along this way here, he ends up running into David Harold, and the two of them continue on to the Surratt House, which is our first stop. And here it is. And so this is actually a historic site that's open to the public. You can visit here. If you are going to be making this drive, you probably want to plan it out ahead of time and contact these sites and make sure that they're open. They're usually open on the weekends, usually, but it would really be disappointing if you went and made this trip and come to find out one of the places was closed for like a, I don't know, special event or something like that. So anyway, if you are going to be making this trip, the best thing to do would be to plan ahead of time and contact them and make sure that they're going to be open. They also have tours. And so you would want to time your visit so that you could get there right when the tour starts. When we used to do our bus trip, the first tour at the Surratt House was at, I think, 10 o'clock in the morning. And so we would meet down at Ford's Theater like at, I don't know, 8 or 8:15 or 8:30. So we had plenty of time to go see that and then make the drive and stop and, I don't know, get a donut or whatever for breakfast. Anyway, this is the historic Surratt House and Tavern, built in 1852. And they have a lot of information at this site about different things related, not only the assassination and Booth's attempted escape, but also the Civil War. So I won't read this whole entire placard here. But suffice to say, this is a really fascinating area in terms of a lot of historical stuff. Because it was a border state, there was also a lot of underground railroad activity that was taking place. And if you're interested in learning about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, they were involved in a lot of different things over here. So just FYI on that. Now, if you think of kind of contemporary modern times, Abraham Lincoln is really popular. He's usually considered our best president. During the time of leading up to the Civil War, and actually during the Civil War, he wasn't quite as popular as he is now. And so in the election of 1860, Lincoln won 59% of the electoral vote, but he only won 40% of the popular vote, which means, looking at it from another perspective, 60% of the people in what was the United States did not vote for Abraham Lincoln. That's a pretty high number. And so I think it's kind of easy to forget that, of how unpopular Lincoln was in various parts of the country, and not even just the Confederate states, but also that he was unpopular in a lot of the border states, which Maryland was. Maryland was still in the Union during the Civil War, but it was what's called a border state. It really had a lot of mixed, say, feelings, so to speak. And then this is the 1860 presidential election, and you can see these were the candidates that were running: Breckinridge, Bell, Douglas, and Lincoln. And then this is the number of votes they received. So in the election of 1860, people living in Maryland there were 92,502 people that voted. And you can see about 46% of them voted for Breckinridge. He was a Southern Democrat. Bell also received a large share of the vote, a little bit over 45%. Stephen Douglas received a small amount. Then look at Lincoln. So he only received 2.5 percentage points of the vote. So only 2,294 people out of the 92,502 that voted actually supported Lincoln. And so I wanted to give you this context because Lincoln is not very popular in this area of Maryland. Now he is in some sectors, but not so much. And so again, Booth's initial plan is not to shoot and kill Lincoln, but during the Civil War, he wanted to kidnap Lincoln. And he thought that he could pull that off and then somehow get him out of DC, Washington, DC. And then the thinking was by Booth and his co-conspirators that if they could just get him to Maryland, that they would find friendly people that would be willing to help them in this endeavor. And so this is really how the assassination begins to unfold and evolve, because Booth is in this area searching for places that he can go to after he kidnaps Lincoln, looking for people that can help him, et cetera, et cetera. And so he spends a lot of time actually trying to put this together and visiting these sites and talking to people, et cetera, et cetera. And so he in particular visited the Mary Surratt Tavern in the final months of the Civil War because he's planning this kidnapping attempt. And so that's how he ends up first coming to this area. And this is kind of what it would have looked like. So this is still a pretty rural area, although it was much more so, of course, back then. It was really not a lot of buildings here when Booth passes through here, as you can see in this historic reproduction. And here is the site now. So after the assassination, Booth and David Harold, they stopped here to pick up supplies because, again, they wanted to travel lightly, leaving Washington, D.C., and then not get bogged down carrying a bunch of stuff with them because they wanted to move very quickly and get out of the city. But once they do get out of the city, they need to kind of stock up on food and supplies and whiskey and all that kind of stuff and guns. And so they're going to do that here. So there's a picture of the Surratt House. It's got this really interesting red paint on this building, makes it very distinctive looking. Oh, here's a good question. Heather asked, what were the weather conditions at the time? They actually were really good. That is a great question, Heather, because what happened if it would have been raining or something like that? But the weather was actually really good for traveling. The sky was clear. There was no rain, et cetera, et cetera. Although it does in this area get pretty cold in April still. So that played a factor. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, good question, Heather. What was the weather like? And again, there's a lot of different historical markers here at the site. I'll explain what this particular plaque is talking about as we go through the presentation, so don't necessarily need to read all this, but this is kind of more for like people that maybe aren't actually making the full drive. And then here is the Surratt Tavern site. And again, this very distinctive red color. And so of course, to show you how times have changed, the gas station right across the street, of course, that wasn't there to be able to stock up on things. And so just kind of imagine late in the evening and Booth and Harold riding up here. It's very dark out. This is a very rural area back then. And so you can kind of imagine them approaching this site. And this is where they're going to start to try their escape after they flee DC. So this was their first kind of official stop, so to speak. And then when you come here, this is a regular museum site. So they have people here, historical reenactors that are dressed up in period costumes, and they'll kind of explain about the history of this site and what was going on. I always like visiting these types of places because not only do you learn about the important people that they're associated with, but it's also just really neat to learn about how did people live in this area during this time? Like, how did people live in this part of Maryland during the mid 1860s? What was that like? So the museum presenters do a great job of that. And of course, they're also explaining the story of John Wilkes Booth. So because this was a small area, this building served a number of different purposes. So there were people that would stay here, like a boarding house. It was also a tavern. It was also a post office. And so interestingly enough, to learn about the mail delivery system back then, I thought that was fascinating when they talked about that. And then this is kind of like how when you go into a hotel, there's the lobby and there's the person working behind the desk and they check in. So that's what this is, this particular room here. So if you were someone else that was going to be staying here, you'd walk in here and there's a person working here. And then the previous slide showed the fact that this was also the post office for the local people that lived in this area. So they would, if someone received mail, it would be delivered here, and then someone would pass through periodically and just check in and say, hey, my name is John Smith. Have I received any mail? And they're like, oh, yeah, here it is. So it was kind of neat to go here and learn about how the mail delivery system worked in rural America at that point in time. And then there's also, they would serve drinks over here as well. So maybe after you've been riding on your horse to check on your mail or whatever, maybe you got a little bit thirsty and needed a refreshment. And so they would do that as well. So it's a post office, it's a tavern, it's a boarding house. It was kind of serving multiple different roles during that time. And then here are those boxes where they'd put the mail. And then here's all the alcohol. So the first time I visited this site, this woman was working, and yeah, she really did a great job of explaining what life was like during the Civil War in this area, and what people were doing, and how this site interacted with them as the post office, tavern, boarding house, etc. And then here he is putting the mail away. So if you needed someone to write you a letter and you're living on a farm, say in the surrounding area, the post delivery people wouldn't actually deliver it to your door. You would deliver it to like one of these like centralized locations. So if you had a letter that needed to be delivered to you, you would have it sent to, say, John Smith at Surratt's Tavern. And then it would be kept here. Then you could show up and actually pick up your mail. So they didn't have home delivery for people in rural areas back then. And of course, as I mentioned, you could also get a drink or a cigar or various other things like that. And, for some people living in this area, they wouldn't have had restaurants and cafes and all that kind of stuff. So it was really a chance for people, local people, to come here and socialize with one another. You could always go up here with a friend or meet a friend here and have a drink and talk about stuff. So this was really kind of like the social center of the surrounding area, because it is a very rural place back then. And again, it's just, so I visited here a number of occasions. It's just neat because they always have the different people working there, and they all kind of have their own areas of expertise, so to speak. So this gentleman was really energetic and was explaining a lot about life, what life was like living back then. So again, neat to visit here because of the connection with the Booth escape route and the Lincoln assassination, but also really, really interesting just to visit here and see what it was like for people to live during this particular time in this particular place. And then slavery was still active in Maryland during the Civil War. And of course, it was very active in the years and decades leading up to the Civil War. So they had this reward poster talking about that. And then, as I mentioned a minute ago, so this area, there was a lot of Underground Railroad activity. And so Harriet Tubman did not come to Surratt Tavern, so don't get confused by that. But I'm just including her picture just kind of as a reminder that, yeah, there was a lot of Underground Railroad activity that was taking place in this area in the time leading up to the Civil War. So if you are visiting here and maybe not continuing on further south, there's a lot of different sites that you can visit in the state of Maryland that are related to the Underground Railroad. So if you want to learn about that topic as well, Maryland is a great place to do that as well. So just to make sure people are clear, Harriet Tubman did not visit Surratt Tavern, just including her as a reminder to make sure you check out the Underground Railroad sites, though, that are in this area. And then there's a nice portrait of Mary Surratt hanging on the wall. So this is the entryway, or like the main hallway of the Surratt Tavern or the Surratt House. And then there she is. Mary Surratt, very interesting and controversial person. The controversy really centers around what her involvement was in the Lincoln assassination and whether or not she should have been executed for her involvement. There's a fair amount of debate on whether or not she was involved in the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, and then whether or not she was or wasn't. What should her say outcome should have been her involvement. My personal beliefs is she was heavily involved in the Lincoln conspiracy, and I don't have an issue with her being executed, just to get that out of the way. But people will talk about this, and we come on our tour. You know, there's some people that think that she was innocent, and that's fine. We don't necessarily need to agree on everything. Or there's some people that think, well, she was probably involved, but maybe she shouldn't have been executed. And so it kind of really runs the full gamut of opinions. And, you know, if you don't agree with me, that's totally fine. People have different opinions, and it's always interesting to kind of talk to people and see, like, well, why do you think that way, and stuff like that. But Mary Surratt's a very controversial figure, for lack of a better word. And so her and her husband actually owned this site, and then her husband passed away, unfortunately, and so she decided to move to Washington, D.C., and so she was still the owner of this property, but she was having it managed by someone else. But yeah, Mary Surratt, one of the most controversial figures in American history. Of my own personal opinion is that she was aware of and involved in the Lincoln assassination and thus suffered the consequences. And so then here's one of our historical reenactors again, talking about the activities that took place at this site. And so again, if you're visiting through here, you could just kind of do it on a whim. But if you plan your trip out ahead of time and find out when the tours are, like if they're having a tour at say 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock, you don't want to show up at 10:30 and kind of have to wait around all day. So just keep that in mind. And this is a really beautiful home. It's furnished in period. And so again, really neat just to kind of see what life was like back then. You might recognize some of these maybe furniture items if your grandparents home had things like this from back in the day and kept them in the family. This was really neat. He was talking about at this particular spot on the tour, he was talking about the food that they ate, like what a typical meal would be, how the food was prepared, stuff like that. So I found that really fascinating. If we had more time, I'd go into that, but we're really kind of focused on the Booth escape route aspect of things. This was, we were visiting here in the fall, and so they had the turkey out. But again, just really neat just to go here and see what life was like back at that point in time. And here's more of a historical. Now this section of the home is the kitchen, and this is where they actually made the food. And so when you go here, it's a lot more than just learning about the role that this site had in the Lincoln assassination / John Wilkes Booth escape route. And so they do spend a lot of time talking about the different, say, daily lives of the people that would have lived here or come here. And so our group really always gotten a kick out of learning about, how did they make food back then? What did they eat? How was it different than today? All that kind of stuff. And so they do a great job talking about that types of things. And so if you're in the Washington, D.C. area or Baltimore, and you only have time to come just to this particular site, it's really worth it, just because it's such a great historical place to visit. To go back here, like for instance, just the cooking and the stove apparatus and how that was different than modern times. All right, and then you go upstairs, and these are the bedrooms. So this is the master bedroom, and so it's decorated in period. And again, just to see how things were different back then. Oh, here's a good question from Sandy. She's wondering, what level of involvement did Mary Surratt have in John Wilkes Booth activities? Well, that's a little bit of a debate because she denied having any involvement in the Lincoln assassination and conspiracy. So it's a little bit of a challenge to kind of figure out exactly her involvement, because until the day she died, she swore that she was innocent. But the military tribunal found her guilty. And I would think that most people that have studied this do believe that she was in fact involved, and but there are a few that for various reasons don't think that she was involved, and that's fine. But there's a lot of things in history that aren't 100% conclusive one way or the other, but not exactly sure her entire involvement, just because she denied any participation until the day she died. This is a second bedroom. This is back when they used to have these ropes across the bed. And of course, there'd be a mattress on top of that. And we didn't have indoor plumbing, so you'd have to do your bathing indoors. And then this is the attic. So Booth had kept some supplies here in anticipation of his plot to kidnap Lincoln. In particular, he had a couple of guns here that he was keeping, a couple of rifles. And so these were stashed up in the attic. Now, during the time of the Civil War, this area was controlled by the Union military. And so Booth and his conspirators thought that it might not be a good idea to have a bunch of guns and stuff laying about in this house in case it was ever searched by the Union Army, which it wasn't until after the assassination. But suffice to say, they were keeping some supplies here. In particular, there was a couple of guns that were kept here. There was also a pair of binoculars that Booth was keeping here. Again, stuff that he didn't want to be encumbered by during his trip out of DC. And then there's a lot of school groups come here. So this particular day, these school children are visiting, learning all about the assassination, things like that. And then on a lot of weekends, they'll have different kind of like special events. Like this particular weekend, there was the Civil War reenactors and some other military reenactors from other periods. We're here kind of talking about different things. You can go check that out. So that would be another good reason why you'd want to check in beforehand prior to your visit, just to see if there's any particular special things that are taking place. And of course, it's also a pilgrimage site for many, many people. So this was funny. This was a group of Abraham Lincoln reenactors that met in Washington, D.C. And so as part of their get together in D.C., they thought they would take a trip down to the Surratt House. And of course, they all got dressed up in their period clothing. So this was a meeting of Abraham Lincoln reenactors. There's like a special group of people that are Lincoln reenactors, and they get together from time to time and talk about different things and stuff like that. So if you're a Lincoln reenactor or want to do so, check that out. And then next door to the actual house, there's a museum, which is really well done. It talks all about the Civil War and the assassination. It might be hard to see, but this is a model of Ford's Theater. And then this is a model of the site where the Booth conspirators were hung after their trial. Booth was not hung here because he died at Garrett Farm, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But anyway, the museum does a good job of kind of explaining various aspects of the Civil War and the assassination. So you could spend at least, if you, at minimum, you probably want to spend at least an hour here, but you could probably spend a couple hours if you wanted to kind of walk around the grounds and study these exhibits in a little more detail. Now I have a short video I thought I would play just so you can kind of see what this site is all about. And they really, really do a great job. Again, I visited here many, many times, learned new things every single time I've come here. The staff is really fabulous. So if you get a chance, make sure you check this out. And so here's a short video telling you a little bit about the Surratt House. And again, thanks so much for joining us.
It was a family home, a tavern, a post office, a hostel, and even a polling place. But those aren't the reasons why thousands of people visit Surratt House Museum every year. Its involvement surrounding one of the most renowned assassinations in history,
you know, the sound on that sounds too faint. Let me check something real quick. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, sorry, I didn't have the sound turned all the way up. Apologies for that. Let me fix that.
It was a family home, a tavern, a post office, a hostel, and even a polling place. But those aren't the reasons why thousands of people visit Surratt House Museum every year. Its involvement surrounding one of the most renowned assassinations in history, the killing of President Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth, is why Surratt House, an ordinary mid-1800s plantation home, lives in infamy. Located in what is now Clinton, Maryland, the house gives a feel of what homes were like during the Civil War era. Though the kitchen wing has been rebuilt, the home still has the original flooring and several items owned by Mary Surratt, the former owner of the home, who became the first woman hanged by the federal government after being convicted as a conspirator in the Lincoln assassination plot. The home was a Civil War safe house for agents of the Confederate underground and soon became involved in the kidnap conspiracy that led to Lincoln's murder. It was the first place that Booth and his accomplice stopped while fleeing Washington, D.C. after killing Lincoln. His leg broken during his escape from Ford's Theater, Booth stopped at the tavern for some whiskey to ease his pain and to pick up supplies for his escape to Virginia, which included a gun which was hidden in the attic a month before as a part of the original kidnap scheme. After Booth was killed in a showdown 12 days after the assassination, a hidden gun, which Booth left behind, was discovered by authorities. It was lodged in the wall between the kitchen and the dining area. During the investigation, authorities cut through the wall to retrieve the rifle, which became a key piece of evidence in Mary Surratt's conviction. In 1976, the museum was opened as the first public historic house museum in Prince George's County. With tours available Wednesdays through Sundays, Surratt House Museum still tells the story of desperate times and desperate deeds during the American Civil War and gives a glimpse of what life was like during that era. So please, visit us at Surratt House to get a glimpse of yesteryears and to learn more about the conspiracy which changed the future of America forever.
All right, so a short video from our friends at Surratt House. So this is a little bit of off the beaten path type of historical site. So I think a lot of people that visit Washington, D.C. and go to the National Mall to see the Smithsonian and the other museums, the Mines Memorials, might not actually make it down here. But if you're looking for kind of like an off the beaten path kind of historical site, this is really a great place to go. Again, they do an excellent job. They have a lot of different programs here. If you're wondering, they said in the video that the authorities showed up here and searched the house. The reason why they knew to come here was because we talked about this in the earlier program, but John Wilkes Booth was recognized when he was on the stage at Ford's Theater after he had shot Lincoln. He yells, "Sic Semper Tyrannis." And so they know pretty quickly that Booth is involved in the assassination of Lincoln. And then the local authorities were told by people that knew Booth or familiar with him and his movements, like, hey, if you want to learn more about John Wilkes Booth, you should go to Mary Surratt's boarding house in Washington, D.C., because he spent a lot of time there. He was friends with John Surratt. And so they do end up going there. And then, of course, when they're there, they learn that Mary Surratt has this other home, or this other property here, this boarding house. And so then, of course, the authorities want to come here and search that site as well. So if you're wondering how they knew to come here, it was because of the investigative work that they had done back in Washington, D.C. All right, so then after the Surratt boarding house, Booth's next kind of official stop was at the Mudd House, the Dr. Mudd House. And this is at a place called Waldorf, Maryland. And here is Dr. Samuel Mudd. He's also a very controversial figure. So let's talk about him. So again, here's Booth's escape route. Leaves Ford's Theater, crosses the Anacostia River, stops first at Surratt Tavern. Now, this is all in the hours immediately after the assassination. So we're not talking about, oh, he visits here, 2 or 3 days later, and another 2 or 3 days visits here. No, this is all in the course of the hours after the first night after the Lincoln assassination is when he visits Surratt Tavern, and then he continues on to Dr. Mudd's house. Now, remember, Booth was tripped up by the flag that was outside the presidential box. In fact, you could almost say that the American flag helped get John Wilkes Booth caught, because if he had not stumbled on the stage and broke a bone in his leg, he would have been able to move a lot quicker, and perhaps he would have been able to escape. So this event ends up taking a significant impact on the story. And if you want to make this drive, it's pretty close. So here's Washington, D.C. Here's the Surratt House, and it's a pretty short drive. If there's no traffic, you can get here in like 25 or 30 minutes. It's only 14 or 18 miles, depending on which way you go. Now, of course, it would have taken Booth a lot longer because he's traveling by horseback at night. But again, you can see it's very quick. If you're in the Northern Virginia suburbs like Arlington and Alexandria, you can cut across the 495 and you can make it down here quicker. You don't have to go all the way into Washington, D.C. Or if you're from Maryland, you can come down the 495 past Joint Base Andrews, and you're right there. If you're not familiar with Washington, D.C. area, Air Force One, the plane the president travels on, usually flies in and out of Joint Base Andrews, formerly known as Andrews Air Force Base. Oh, so all right, let me go back. So this is a key part of the story, the fact that he stopped at Dr. Mudd's house. When Booth was probably thinking about his escape from Washington, D.C., he probably was not initially planning on stopping at Dr. Mudd's house. However, he breaks a bone in his leg, which is causing him a lot of discomfort and pain. And so he decides that he needs to stop. David Harold, who was accompanying Booth along their journey, said, no, let's not go to Dr. Mudd's house. Let's continue on further south. We have to get away from Washington, D.C. as quickly as possible. And so there was a little bit of a debate there. Now, one reason why John Wilkes Booth partnered up with David Harold was because David Harold was from this area. He was familiar with this region of the country. Booth, even though he had visited here periodically, he's not really familiar with this area. You know, they don't have GPS and iPhones back then, and they don't have as many signs, and it would be really easy to get lost and be traveling at night. And so it was really important to Booth that he have Harold with him, which is another kind of hypothetical thing, like what would have happened if Booth was traveling through here on his own. It would have been much more challenging for him because he did have a broken leg and he did not know this area. I forgot to mention that, going back to the Surratt House, when Booth visited here, because he was in such bad shape physically because he broke a bone in his leg, he did not get off his horse. He, being Booth, did not get off his horse and never actually go inside the building, as far as we know. David Harold did that. So David Harold went in and got the whiskey and the binoculars and the gun that they wanted to take with them, et cetera, et cetera. So then again, at this point in time, as they're riding south, there's a debate on what they should do. Booth wants to stop Dr. Mudd's house to have him look at his leg. He knows something must be wrong with it because he's in excruciating pain. He essentially says that I can't take this anymore. I can't continue on any further. I'm exhausted. You also have to remember that when Booth shot Lincoln, he had been up all day. So he got up early in the morning, and then he ends up shooting Lincoln, and then they've been riding all night. So it'd been an extremely long day. So Booth was exhausted. Harold, though, wanted to continue on south and skip Dr. Mudd's house. Again, how history would have played out differently had they not stopped here. Maybe Booth would have gotten away. So I put the star here because this is a key point in the journey. This kind of fork in the road, so to speak, literally and figuratively speaking, of whether they should stop or not stop. But because Booth was kind of in charge, so to speak, they do end up stopping. And then I wanted to show you this aerial view. So this today is still a very rural area, although it would have been even more so back then. So Dr. Mudd's house is not in a city, so to speak. It's in a very rural area. And it's a really beautiful part of the country. Growing up in Detroit, I've always enjoyed traveling through here. Just the geography is very stunning to me. And there's a lot of farms and things like that in this area, as you can imagine. And that's actually the Dr. Mudd house here off in the distance. Now, when you travel through here, if it's ever dark out, there's not street lights and a lot of signs pointing out where to go. And, we have modern maps and things like that. We're in the comfort of our cars. Booth would have been traveling without that kind of modern technology, and he would have been also doing it at night. And of course, his leg is also broken. So it was much more challenging for him to travel back then. And then, so because they don't have street lights, and there's not as many businesses and things lit up, particularly late at night, what does this area look like at night? Well, here's a photo that I tried to take, but I'm not a good night photographer. But essentially, when you're traveling through this area, even today, it's almost like pitch black. Like if you're driving down the road, it's really just your headlights lighting up stuff. So yeah, there would have been a little bit of moonlight, but it would have been really challenging for Booth and Harold to find Dr. Mudd's place. In fact, they actually did get a little bit lost on the way there, which slowed them up a little bit. But eventually they find it and end up showing up at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. And kind of like the Surratt House, this is a really great place to visit because not only do you learn about the connection this site has to the Lincoln assassination, but it's also fascinating to find out how people lived back in this point in time in this particular area. John Wilkes Booth rested here for several hours on April 15th, 1865, after receiving treatment for his broken leg. And here is the approach to the Dr. Mudd house. So what you do is you pull off the road, and then you can't see it, but over here to the left is the parking lot. And there's another one over here. And then you just walk up to the house. And again, kind of similar to the Surratt House, you probably want to contact the home ahead of time or this site ahead of time and find out when their tours are, especially if you're trying to squeeze a bunch of stuff into the same day. And another view of the home. So Dr. Mudd, in addition to being a doctor, was also a farmer, and he owned slaves to help him manage the property. So Dr. Mudd lived here with his wife and their children. But in addition to being a doctor, he's also a farmer. So imagine during this point in time, people from around the area, they don't have hospitals that they could go visit. So if there was some problem, they would come see Dr. Mudd, or perhaps he could make a house call if need be. And so this is the view from the house looking back towards the street. So you come down the street here, you pull in here, and here's the parking lot. Now these homes here and here are much more modern, of course. They wouldn't have been there. So again, a very rural area. And you can imagine Booth and Harold riding up on their horses late at night on the early morning hours of Saturday, April 15th, after they had been involved in the Lincoln shooting. And so just some pictures of the home. They have talks outside. So what you do when you show up here, they'll take on a tour inside the house, and then the museum staff member will take you outside. People can kind of sit around on the picnic benches, and they'll kind of continue to talk about things in this area. And so this was the first time we made this journey. So you might recognize the site. And so she's all dressed up in period costume. So again, you go on the tour the inside the house, and then you come out here and she'll talk more about the site, answer questions that people have, et cetera, et cetera. And here was another view, same day. Again, really beautiful property and really neat to learn about how people lived in rural Maryland during the Civil War era. Like, for instance, they didn't have running water, so they had to use the well to get their water. And then just a really beautiful area. So this site, you probably want to budget at least an hour to spend here just to go on the tour and kind of walk around a little bit. You could easily spend a couple hours here. Like myself, growing up in Detroit, we didn't have a lot of farms in that area. So I've just always been intrigued by farms and farming and stuff like that. So it was neat just to kind of walk around this area and see what it looked like. And so here's the home off in the distance, the Surratt home. And then the parking lot we parked was over here. And then the main road that runs through this area is over here. So this is me just kind of walking around this site, checking things out. Another view of the home. This was one time we visited. Usually when we used to do this bus trip, we used to always do it in April to coincide with the actual anniversary of the event. But in the time before COVID, we actually scheduled a special trip one time in the fall. So they were getting ready for the fall harvest and all that kind of related stuff. And of course, the well, you don't have running water in homes back then. So if you needed water, you had to get it out of the well. And at least at this home, the well was pretty close to the home. In some other instances, it would have been much further away. So that would have been problematic or challenging for people. And then these are two of the historical interpreters that were at the site. A husband and wife team dressed in their period costumes, their period clothing. And so then in another visit, just talking about the things that took place here. When we visited here, a lot of people, of course, did have questions about the Lincoln assassination, but a lot of people did have questions about, hey, what was it like to live during that time? And just wanted to know more about that. If you could go in a time machine and travel back here, what that would have been like for people in terms of how they lived, all those types of aspects. So I thought that was neat. All right, Dr. Samuel Mudd House, circa 1830. Placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then here is the site. So let's go inside and look around. But before we do, you can see John Wilkes Booth looking out the window. So he shows up here with Harold and needs treatment for his leg. This is just giving you some historical information on Dr. Samuel Mudd, born on December 20th, 1833, to one of the oldest families in the state of Maryland. Mudd first came to Maryland, or the Mudds family first came to Maryland from England in the 1600s. Dr. Mudd married his childhood sweetheart, Sarah, on Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1857. As a wedding gift, his father gave him 218 acres. If you're not familiar with an acre, is about the size of a football field here in this area. Let's see, this remains one of the few plantations in Maryland that has been in the same family for more than 2 centuries. And then it just talks more about Dr. Mudd's family, et cetera, et cetera. Following the assassination of President Lincoln on Friday night, April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth fled from Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., stopping first to pick up supplies at the Surratt House in Prince George's County, Maryland, as we mentioned. From there, he and his accomplice, David Harold, traveled south to Charles County looking for medical assistance for Booth's leg, which he had injured while escaping from Ford's Theater. At approximately 4 a.m., on April 15th, they had arrived. So it was a really long day. By the time 4 a.m. showed up, Booth had been awake for about 21 or 22 hours. So it would have been a very long ordeal for him. On April 15th, they arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Claiming to have fallen off his horse, Booth received medical attention and remained here until the late afternoon. The dirt road leading away from the back of the Mudd house, and the same road traveled by Booth and Harold that afternoon as they left Dr. Mudd's home, et cetera, et cetera. So they have also a lot of historical markers here explaining the site. There's a nice portrait of Dr. Mudd. And his role in this series of events is also very controversial because there's some debate on what his involvement was. In particular, did he know that he was treating the leg of John Wilkes Booth? He claimed later that he did not recognize Booth, which some people thought suspicious because he and Booth had met previously. And another thing that did him in was his story changed a lot. During the preceding times, he was interrogated by the authorities. So, but again, that being said, there's a little bit of a debate on whether or not he was involved. My own personal opinion was that he was and was guilty. But that being said, there's some people that, for various reasons, think that he was not, and that's totally fine. But again, for me, or other people as well. Part of the issue with him is, number one, he's met John Wilkes Booth before. So it seems kind of strange that he would have treated his broken leg, not recognized him. And number two, his story changed a lot. You see that frequently in crime investigations when someone's story changes a lot. Oftentimes there's reasons for that. And his home, though, is really beautiful. It's a great classic example of kind of mid 1800s Maryland, kind of like country gentleman estate, so to speak. So here's the parlor, decked out with period furniture. And so again, when you go here and go on the tour, they talk about the Mudds and how they lived here and what kind of activities they took place. So you have a nice piano over here, table and sofa, pictures and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the objects here are original, so that's a nice touch. Like, for instance, look at this table has a checkerboard on top of it, so you can play checkers, or they could cover it with a tablecloth and use it for more formal purposes. Here's a desk. So remember, back at this point in time, they didn't have telephones or the internet or cell phones. So if you someone living somewhere else, the only way to really communicate with them is by writing letters. And so this is the desk that the family would use to write letters or correspondence to people in different places. And then, people, of course, back then read books and magazines and stuff like that. So some examples of those. And then this is an adjacent area where they have some additional like museum exhibits related to the series of events that took place here. As you can see, please do not touch. They preferred if people didn't try and play the piano themselves because it's historic. And then this is neat. This is the dining room, the Dr. Mudd and his family's dining room. So they have it set up for a nice dinner, all the china and silverware and stuff like that. And then here's the view looking the other way. And so again, when you come here, it's really neat to just learn about, what kind of meals did people eat and what was the food preparation like and all that kind of stuff. And so Dr. Mudd was pretty well off. His family was pretty wealthy. Again, he's kind of has a dual career. He's both a doctor, which was not really a full-time job because there's only so many people living in this area. He did provide a very valuable service to all the people in the surrounding community because there were no hospitals or any other doctors in the surrounding area. So if somebody needed some type of medical treatment, he would have been a great resource for them. But that being said, there's not enough work, so to speak, for a doctor full-time. And so he's also, in addition to being a doctor, he was also a farmer. So he kind of had like a dual career back then. And Booth initially meets Mudd because he's out looking for horses. As part of the conspiracy plan, Booth is thinking that when he kidnaps Lincoln and brings them south, they're probably going to have to switch horses from time to time just so they can keep moving. You can only ride a horse so long before it needs to take a break. And so initially he had talked to Dr. Mudd about perhaps buying horses from him, supposedly. And then this is the upstairs. So this is the master bedroom. So this is where Dr. Mudd and his wife stayed. Again, really neat to go here and see these period furnishings and see how people lived back then. Here's guns. This is an extra room. So this is now the upstairs of the house. All right, so now this is the room that Booth stayed in. So Booth and Harold show up at the site. Booth says that his leg is injured. Dr. Mudd examines it. So, you broke a bone in your leg. He examines him. He puts, they give him some splints to kind of keep it in place and wrap it and bandage. He does kind of give him a makeshift device so that he can walk. And then Booth, by now, he's exhausted. He wants to get some sleep. He's in agonizing pain. So Dr. Mudd and David Harold help Booth up the stairs into this bedroom. So this is where John Wilkes Booth spent the night after the assassination. So there's two beds here. So Dr. Mudd's guests, Booth stayed in one bed and Harold stayed in the other. Notice the cross here, which is interesting. Sleeping under the crucifixion, Booth was. And so this was the crutch that Booth could use to hobble around on. And then, so to treat Booth's leg, Mudd had to cut his boot off. So John Wilkes Booth's leg was so swollen because of the injury that he suffered when he fell from Fort Cedar. Dr. Mudd actually had to take a pair of scissors and shear off his boot. And so the boot got left behind. And that was another piece of damning evidence against Mudd, because you can't see it here, but Booth's initials are on this boot, and this got left behind. And so that was a key piece of evidence as well. And then now to this day, the family of Dr. Mudd still claims that he was innocent in any type of involvement with this. And so this was a story from back in 2015. You can see the date here. The family of Dr. Samuel Mudd still trying to unmuddy the name. And you might have heard that term before, someone's name is Mudd. Supposedly comes from this particular event. But back in the summer of 2000, when I was a reporter at the Washington Post, I spoke to Dr. Richard Mudd of Saginaw, Michigan, who was 99 years old and still fighting to clear the name of his grandfather, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, who treated John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated President Lincoln in 1865. Just months before I spoke to him, the U.S. Army had rejected his bid to overturn the conspiracy conviction of his grandfather. So the family, as far as I know, every recent president has received a request to try and clear Dr. Mudd's name or involvement in this event, but it's never taken place. He said, quote, "I will fight until I'm dead," he told me by phone from his Saginaw, Michigan home. "I'm holding on day to day in hopes they exonerate my grandfather. He died May 2002 at the age of 101. The family name remained Mudd. Now, 13 years later, the campaign by family to clear the name goes on. It's still Mudd." So yeah, this is continuing on. You'll still see stories about this. I just saw, I haven't seen it maybe in like a year or so, but I thought a couple of years ago, this particular instance came up. So FYI on that. And then it's really interesting because the local elementary school is named after Dr. Mudd. So that's kind of unusual in my opinion. The fact that this guy, Dr. Mudd, was convicted of being involved in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy, but yet the local school was named after him, the elementary school. So Dr. Mudd did do some good things after the assassination. He was arrested. He was in a prison in Florida, and there was an epidemic that broke out, and he helped save a lot of prisoners' lives and also a lot of the staff members, the guards' lives. So he did kind of rebuild his reputation a little bit, so to speak. And then at that point in time, he was pardoned for his efforts. So, but interesting aspect nonetheless. All right. So those are the two most popular sites that people go to outside of Fort Cedar, just because they're the closest to the cities of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. They're the easiest to get to. But there's a few other places that you can visit if you do end up making this journey. And I want to talk about them so you can learn more about the Booth escape attempt. So the next place you can go visit is called Rich Hill. And this is also in Maryland. Now, this particular site, we're continuing south here. Booth's hopes is that he can get across the Potomac River here to Virginia. So during the Civil War, Maryland was a border state, remained in the Union, but there was a lot of Southern sympathizers here. Virginia, though, is a Confederate state during the Civil War. And so because the war is still going on, Robert A. Lee had surrendered at this point in time, but there was still a lot of fighting taking place. Booth's plan is to escape from the Union lines, so to speak, and make his way to Virginia. So after he leaves Dr. Mudd's house, they stayed there. They showed up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They essentially slept all the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. And then around dinner time, when it started to get dark out, they then ventured out and continued on further south. Now, if you want to visit this Rich Hill site, it's also not very far away. You can see here's Dr. Mudd's house, and there's a few different ways you can go to get here, but you're talking about 17 miles or so, and you can get to the Rich Hill Farm. So these sites are not, that we're going to be talking about next, aren't as well known to the kind of the general public. I think a lot of people have heard of the Mary Surratt boarding house, or they've heard of Dr. Mudd, or they know that Booth was killed at the barn at Garrett's Farm. They don't maybe know as much about the other kind of aspects of the Booth escape journey that took place. So let's talk about those and kind of fill in some gaps. And so here is the Rich Hill site. This particular site is open to the public. However, they only have programs here periodically. This property is in the process of being, say, redeveloped. And so kind of keep that in mind. Mid 18th century farmhouse with alterations after 1800 was home of Colonel Samuel Cox. This Southern sympathizer fed and sheltered fugitive John Wilkes Booth and David E. Harold before dawn on Easter Sunday, April 16, 1865. Lincoln was shot on Good Friday, April 14, 1865. Following Booth's assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, Booth and Harold hid in woods until the night of April 21st, when Cox's foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, helped them escape across the Potomac River. So this is a really fascinating part of the story that not a lot of people are familiar with. So let's talk about what took place here. Remember, going back to the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, he only received 2.5% of the vote in Maryland. I don't have the exact figures for how many people voted for him in this particular area where Booth is now at, but I'm guessing it was probably minimal, if any. People would have supported Lincoln at that point in time. And so these are the two gentlemen that are involved in this part of the story. It's Samuel Cox. He's the owner of this property. And then his relative, Thomas Jones, they were both Confederate sympathizers. So it was Cox that owned the property that Booth would stay at during his time here. And then he didn't really want to get involved, though, with John Wilkes Booth. He was kind of nervous about getting arrested or found out about. So he kind of delegated it to this relative of his, Thomas Jones, who was a very interesting individual. And so Jones is the one who was really assisting Booth, and we'll talk about both of them in a little bit. Rich Hill, the fugitive seek shelter. I'll talk about the things that are in this plaque, so we don't have to read that. Rich Hill through the years. All right, so here's the property. Now, this site, again, it's not normally, you can't go inside, at least you couldn't as of a year ago. But they do have special events here and programs. So one time on our trip, we actually had it coincide with like an annual event. They, of course, have a lot of events that take place around the anniversary of the assassination. But if you just kind of show up here on some random day of the week and expect to go inside the home, that's not going to be happening. So they're in the process of refurbishing this house, and hopefully at some point in time it will be open to the public, but that's not the case now. But that being said, it's still really fascinating to visit this site because it plays such an important role in the Booth escape attempt. And again, you can kind of imagine Booth and Harold showing up here late at night. Now, Booth was a little upset because he actually wanted to stay inside the home like he had done at Dr. Mudd's house. But the owner of this property, knowing what had took place, because Booth told him, it's like, I don't think I want the guy who just shot the president of the United States staying in my home. And so what he told him is, you can stay here, but you need to sleep out in the woods. You can't come inside. He would have obviously been very concerned that there would have been people looking for Booth. And if they showed up here, like the authorities or the military looking for Booth and find him inside his house, that he would have been in big trouble. Whereas if they found him in like the woods or something, he claimed that he didn't know anything about Booth being here. So that was kind of his plan. But Booth was really upset by that. He thought that this guy should let him stay inside the house in the comfort of a nice warm bed. And the guy's like, no way, you can stay here, but you got to sleep out in the woods, buddy. And so that would ends up happening. And so this also, of course, a very rural area. So the guy basically points out to the woods and like, hey, go sleep out there somewhere. So that's what he ends up doing. So very different, because John Wilkes Booth, you know, a lot of people are into camping and stuff. John Wilkes Booth was a city guy. He had always stayed in like nice hotels and fancy homes. He wasn't used to sleeping out in the woods under the sky and bugs and all that kind of stuff, but that's what he has to end up doing. John Wilkes Booth and David Harold remained hidden from April 16th to April 21st in a nearby pine thicket while Union troops searched for them. Thomas A. Jones, he was the guy that was on the right side of the pictures I showed you earlier, brought them food and newspapers. So let me go back to those pictures. So Samuel Cox, the owner of the property, he's the guy that would not let Booth stay in his house. But Thomas Jones was assisting Booth, and we'll talk about him in just a moment. So here's another. So this is, they don't know the exact spot where Booth stayed, because this part of the story actually did not come out until sometime later. And the details were, this information did not come out immediately after Booth was captured, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so it took a little bit of time for this story to come out. So they don't know oh, Booth slept under this exact tree. They don't have that level of detail, so to speak. But anyway, he was sleeping in the woods here. This is if you walk outside the home and start, wandering about. I mean, this is what it looks like. I mean, imagine spending several nights sleeping out in the area. Like, they didn't have a tent. They had a few blankets, but that was pretty much it. And then this is, mid to late April in Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. It's still pretty cold at that point in time. And then, of course, they didn't have mattresses or off mosquito repellent or anything like that. They didn't have an opportunity to take a shower or a bath or anything. So it would have been very challenging, especially for Booth. He was not used to living outdoors. And of course, shortly after the assassination, they know that Booth's involved. And so there's all these people out looking for him. And so at several different times while Booth and Harold were staying here, they heard the Union cavalry passing by down roads. They were scouring the countryside looking for Booth. Now, what they didn't know is he was kind of right under their nose, so to speak. He was hiding out in this pine thicket that they not searched. They were kind of on the roads and highways and stuff. They didn't search every single inch of the territory. It's just too much land to cover. So that's how Booth was able to kind of stay hidden for several days, even though the Union cavalry was out looking for him. And one of the things that's interesting aspect of this story. So Booth was really interested in learning about how his assassination was playing out in the public eye, so to speak. So one of the things that he was asking for while he's hiding here was he was really interested in getting newspapers to see how the news coverage of his involvement in this activity was taking place. And much to his surprise, there was shock and horror. He thought that people in the South would really celebrate what he did, and that even maybe some Northerners would be in favor because of Lincoln not being universally admired, so to speak. But it was actually the opposite. Even people in the South just thought this was a very cowardly act. So he was really upset and distraught by that. He just thought that he would be a hero down South for shooting Lincoln. And while there were some people that were kind of okay with that, the consensus was no, that was not a good thing to do. So while Booth is here in the woods, part of the reason why we know what he was doing and what he was involved in is he kept a diary. So he had a notebook that he wrote some notes in. So it wasn't like an official diary, but he did kind of write down some random thoughts he had. And the diary is actually in the possession at Ford's Theater. So John Wilkes Booth's diary: when Booth fled Ford's Theater, he carried with him few items: an appointment book that he used as a diary, a compass, and a Bowie knife. Along his escape route, Booth met up with fellow conspirator David Harold and traveled with him to Mary Surratt's Tavern in Maryland. There they picked up field glasses or binoculars and a Spencer carbine rifle. So Booth thought that he might have to have a shootout with someone, particularly the Union military. So he wanted to be more armed. So that's why he picked up this carbine rifle. Booth's diary provides unique insight into the mind of Lincoln's killer. Booth expected to be hailed as a hero, but instead he was condemned for his actions. And he knows that because Thomas Jones is bringing him newspapers on a regular basis while he's hiding out here. So he can read about the media coverage of the events that took place. And then here's an excerpt from Booth's diary. I struck boldly and not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his, meaning Lincoln's, friends, was stopped but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted "Sic Semper" before I fired, which is not true. In jumping, broke my leg. There's a little bit of a debate. Some people say that Booth broke his leg when his horse fell. That was just a story that he told people. He actually admits the fact that he broke his leg when he jumped at Ford's Theater, because it's here in this diary. So that's important note. I passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. He tries to make it as dramatic sounding as possible because, hey, he's an actor. I can never repent it, though we hated to kill, meaning he hated to kill President Lincoln, supposedly. Our country, meaning the South, the Confederacy, owed all our troubles to him, meaning Lincoln. And God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. The country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country. So really interesting to get the insights into the mind of Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth. It's interesting that he says, I care not what becomes of me. Well, how can that be true when he's trying to escape? If he cares not what becomes of him, why would he just turn himself into authority? So his writings are riddled with lies and misconceptions and things like that, but they're still interesting nonetheless. All right, so Booth has to continue on. He's been staying in this wooded area for quite a few days, and he really wants to get moving. He knows he has to get south. Thomas Jones, the guy who's helping him, says, hey, the best thing that you can do is just stay put in these woods and wait for kind of things to quiet down and then start to move south. He's like, it's just too many people out looking for you. So Thomas Jones, the local guy who was helping Booth and David Harold stay in the woods, he was bringing them food and the newspapers and checking on them and stuff like that. He's like, you guys just need to stay put. Don't travel now. There's too many people looking for you. Now, of course, the search for Booth is not going to die down in a matter of days. It's going to continue on. So that strategy was maybe a little bit suspect. And then again, Samuel Cox, the guy that owned the property that Booth was staying on. And then this is the gentleman, Thomas Jones. He was a very savvy individual, Jones was. Now remember, Booth and Harold traveled here by horse. And Jones was really concerned of the fact that the Union cavalry would pass by. Here, their horses, Booth and Harold's horses, making a commotion or making some type of noise, and then they would come to investigate, and Booth and Harold would get killed. And so Jones convinces Harold to shoot and kill the horses that they traveled here on, because he was thinking, Booth and Harold by themselves can stay a lot quieter if it's just the two of them. If there's two horses out and about making noise, again, the Union cavalry who's looking for the two of them might hear those noises, and they might think it's kind of suspicious. If there's two horses out in the middle of the woods, they might come to investigate things, and then things can go downhill. So Jones convinces Harold to shoot and kill the two horses, which he did. So somewhere in that wooded area is the horses that John Wilkes Booth and David Harold rode to get to this point. But what ended up happening to them, who knows, because their bodies have never been found, because that was years later. And so Jones's idea is to have them travel by boat across the river, and Jones himself will ride them on his horses to the water, and they can cross the Potomac River and get to Maryland. So if you continue on and you're driving through this area, it's still very rural. This is the Potomac River here. So this is Maryland over here. This is the side of the water that Booth was staying on. And they want to get over here to Virginia because they know there's even more Southern sympathizers, of course, in the state of Virginia, because it was part of the Confederacy. The war is not over yet, although even though Robert E. Lee's army has surrendered, there's still fighting going on. And so this was a depiction of, from the era that was in Harper's Weekly, of Booth and Harold crossing the Potomac River. And so the guy who's helping him is going to take them down to the river, and then he obtained a boat for them, and then he's going to have them take the boat across the river, and they're going to do it at night because of course they don't want anyone to see them. Now, what does this area look like at night? Here's another night photo I took of this area, so to give you a sense of what it looks like. Well, of course, it's pitch black in this area, so there's not businesses and things in this area, and especially even more so back then. There's no street lights and stuff like that, so it would have been pitch dark out when they traveled. And then so they also timed their journey across the river when there would be little minimal amount of moonlight. And so that's what they're going to do. They're going to try and get from Maryland across the Potomac River to Virginia. Now, they had a problem though, because it was so dark out, they got lost on the river. So what they needed to do is they needed to go directly south. But Booth has a compass on him, but he's not able to turn a light on to see it because there's Union ships. The Union Navy is patrolling the river. They have been doing so since the time of the Civil War, and they're especially doing it now because people have theorized that Booth is potentially trying to escape down this route. And so there's all these ships that are patrolling Potomac River looking for anything suspicious. And so Booth is cognizant of that, and they're going to go across the river, but they have to do so extremely quietly and in the darkness because they don't want the Union Navy to see them. So instead of going south to get to Virginia, they got disoriented and they actually ended up going west. And so they're rowing and they're rowing and they're rowing. God, this is taking a long time to get across the river. What is taking so long? Because remember, if you go back and look at it from this view I took, this might not look like a long distance, but it's because the car is elevated on the bridge. But this is also taken during the day. It's, imagine this being pitch dark out. There's no businesses or anything over here. If there's not any moonlight, which there wasn't on the night that they tried to get across the river, it would have been essentially like going off in the darkness. If you've ever driven down a road in a rural area and you only have your headlights lighting up the road in front of you, you know what I'm talking about. It can be pitch black and it's really hard to see where you're going. And so that actually ends up playing a role in the fact that they got lost on the river. And then of course, Harold, even though he's familiar with this area, he's not an expert at taking boats across the river. That's not something he had done. So they end up getting lost and they're traveling and traveling. Finally, they end up back here and they think that maybe they're in Maryland, or they think that maybe they're in Virginia, but come to find out they're actually still in Maryland, which of course really frustrated them. And so they end up finding someone, this gentleman by the name of Colonel Hughes, who lets them stay at his place. So this kind of lack of planning and time delays is another thing that really trips up Booth. I put a star by the slides that had a key impact on his getting caught. And so again, Booth assassinates Lincoln kind of on a spur of the moment, even though he had been planning the kidnapping plot throughout, but he didn't really plan out or think out how this part of the crime was going to take place. He was almost solely focused on just shooting Lincoln. And he didn't really think about, okay, what am I going to do afterwards? Where am I going to stay? What am I going to do? And again, he's not familiar with this area. So the fact that he got hung up because of the broken leg and then he had to stay in the woods and then he ended up getting lost on the water, it really slows him down. If he had just been able to go continuously and go south, who knows, maybe he could have made it to Atlanta or Charleston or Mexico or something. No one's not quite sure where he was going. But these delays and this lack of planning really ended up tripping him up and causing him to get caught. Now let's go off on a little bit of a tangent for just a moment. There's the John Brown site, which is at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. So I want to talk about this for a minute because this relates to John Wilkes Booth. And this is also a great historical site to visit, Harper's Ferry National Historical Park. It's about an hour drive outside of Washington, D.C. if there's no traffic. It's a really beautiful geographic area. I used to live not too far from here. And John Brown, so you've probably heard about him. He was the guy that during the years leading up to the Civil War was involved in all different types of activities to try and end slavery. And he ends up taking over this arsenal at Harper's Ferry trying to lead a slave uprising, which didn't end up materializing. And so then Brown is captured by the Union Army, which was being commanded at this particular time, this particular unit, by Robert E. Lee, ironically. So Brown gets captured, and then he's put on trial and is executed for his crimes. Now, Booth is aware of what happened to John Brown because it was a big story, obviously, and also because Booth actually came to Harper's Ferry to see the execution of John Brown. So yes, John Wilkes Booth, prior to the Civil War, he actually traveled to Harper's Ferry himself to see the execution of John Brown. And he was also, before that, closely following the trial. And that happened because Brown was captured alive. And so then he was put on trial. He was found guilty and he was executed. Now, Booth actually shows up at that site. This is actually a photo that Booth gave to his sister. And some people think that this gentleman here is actually John Wilkes Booth. He had borrowed some clothing and hooked up with a bunch of military guys that were going there to kind of keep tabs on things. And so he hooked up with them and took the train from there. So anyway, the point being that Booth knows this story or this situation with John Brown and the fact that he was captured alive, he was put on trial and executed. Booth does not want to suffer the same fate that John Brown received. He does not want to get captured alive. He does not want to be put on trial. He does not want to be executed. And so this part of the story is really important in kind of understanding his psyche and the events that take place in our next stop, which is Garrett's Farm. This is in a place called Port Royal, Virginia. Now, remember, Booth is trying to get south. There's not, it's not entirely known what exactly Booth's plans were. He probably did not figure it out himself. His goal is just to get as far south as quickly as possible. Where he was planning on ending up at is anyone's guess. Who knows, maybe he would have went to Charleston or Atlanta or Texas or Mexico. It's really a lot of debate. But anyway, he wants to get south. He's come quite a ways. He finally crosses the river. And so you can make the drive from, you can't really stop at this site over here. There's not really much to see. So I haven't included in my tour. You can go check out the area if you want. But it's a little bit off the, even more off the beaten path. But anyway, this trip from Rich Hill to Garrett's Farm is not too far. Now, this is another thing that ends up getting Booth caught. They crossed the river. They crossed the main river here, the Potomac River. Then there's a second river. It's hard to see. It's right here. It's the Rappahannock River. So there's a second river that they have to cross. Now, at this particular location, they're in the Confederacy. They thinking there's more people that are be sympathetic to their cause or their situation, but they encounter this ferry as they're traveling. And so they decide to cross here, Booth and Harold do. But in doing so, they encounter two people that would later report them to the authorities. So this is kind of how essentially they really, the Union troops that were looking for Booth really kind of closed the gap, so to speak, because when they crossed this ferry, the couple that did so ended up later reporting to him and Harold to the authorities. So there's, after Lincoln is killed, President Andrew Johnson takes over, of course, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is leading the manhunt, so to speak, to capture Booth. There's reward posters that are being distributed. People are going, the Union cavalry is scouring the countryside looking for Booth. They're asking pretty much anybody that they encountered, have you seen John Wilkes Booth, who was a famous guy, or have you seen anyone that looks like this? Here's the famous reward posters. They put, you know, and $100,000 back then would have been millions of dollars today. This was the largest reward that had ever been offered in the United States. And so this would have been millions and millions of dollars in modern times money. And so there was a big interest. There were also a lot of people, just individuals that were out looking for Booth, just people that thought, you know, if I can find him on my own, I can keep the money. So the military was looking for him, but then also a lot of private individuals were also looking for Booth. And they knew that Surratt was friends with Booth, and eventually they were able to put the piece together. So that's why he's on the poster. They also knew that Booth was friends with David Harold, so they were also looking for him. Now they don't know the full extent of the conspiracy, so to speak, so they're putting the pieces together. But that being said, they're on the lookout for these guys. And so the Union cavalry is, again, searching the countryside, stopping people, asking questions, investigating things. Now, just to go back a little bit, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, which was a Sunday. On Friday, April 14th is when the assassination took place. And after Lee's army surrenders, a lot of people start traveling home, wherever home is. And so this was the story that Harold and Booth were telling people. They told them that they were Confederate soldiers that were trying to make their way back home, which is why they were traveling and why Booth was injured. So that was kind of part of their ruse, so to speak. But that being said, Union cavalry is in full force. It's really, you can't really underemphasize how much effort there was to try and find Booth. I mean, this was the biggest crime that ever been committed in our nation's history. He was on the run, and people are looking for him extensively. And so they try and cross the Rappahannock River, and the ferry people did them in. So when they crossed the river, they actually asked the people, the couple that ran this ferry, was a husband and wife team, did they know of any place where they could spend the night? And prior to them even going on the ferry, Booth and Harold encountered three Confederate cavalry guys. And so those guys were actually giving them rides on their horses. But the five of them said, hey, do you guys know of any place that we can stay? And the river crossing people, the ferry people, said, oh, you could probably maybe stay at Garrett's Farm. And one of the three Confederate cavalrymen that had met Booth and Harold and was now traveling with them said, oh, I know where that is. I can take you there. And they're like, oh, okay, fine. Now, when the Union cavalry shows up a short time later and says, hey, have you seen anybody suspicious? There's a guy with maybe a mustache, it's John Wilkes Booth, and he's got an injured leg, and there's these two guys traveling together because they kind of started to put some of the pieces together. The couple that ran the ferry said, oh, yeah, we know that guy. And it just so happened that the three cavalrymen that Booth and Harold had met up with just prior to joining or crossing the ferry, one of them knew the woman that was, along with her husband, operated the ferry. So just to make sure everyone's understand. So Booth and Harold, they're traveling, and prior to crossing this ferry, they meet these three Confederate cavalry guys, strike up a conversation with them. They ask if the Confederate guys can transport them a ways, and they say, yeah, we can. And then when they get on the ferry, the woman who, along with her husband, was operating the ferry, recognized one of the guys, the Confederate cavalry guys, and knew him from prior days. And so then when the Union cavalry shows up, she's like, oh yeah, we saw the guy with the hurt leg, and he was with these three soldiers, and one of the soldiers, et cetera, this is his name, and this is where he lives, et cetera. So that's how they're able to track him down. So I'm kind of skipping over a lot of pieces because this is a very complex story. It takes many days over a lot of miles. This is a little bit of the Cliff's Notes version, but there's a lot more facets to it than just that. But essentially, they track down the Confederate cavalry guy, the Union cavalry does, and says, hey, where's the guy with the injured leg? He said, oh, he's over at this other place. He's at Garrett's Farm. And so the Union cavalry arrests the Confederate cavalry guy, even though the war is over, for his involvement with Booth, and they have him take them to Garrett's Farm. And the Confederate guy says, yeah, this is where I dropped him off, meaning Booth. And so he's here. And so then the cavalry shows up at Garrett's Farm. It's late at night, and they ride over there and knock on the door. And the owner of the farm says, they're like, hey, where's the two guys that were dropped off here? We want to search your house. And they say, well, he's not here, or they're not here. They're staying in the barn. So the people that actually owned the house, they kind of had an uneasy feeling about Booth and Harold. They thought maybe their story was a little suspicious. They thought maybe that they were going to try and rob them. So they said, well, you can't stay in our house, but you can stay in the barn if you want. And so when the Union cavalry shows up and says, hey, where's the two guys that are staying here? on this property, the owner of the farm says they're not in the house, they're actually in the barn. And so again, one of the key things was the fact that Booth didn't plan out his trip. He injured his leg, he got slowed down at Dr. Mudd's house, and then staying in the woods, and then taking the wrong way across the river. But when they stopped at that ferry, and the woman that co-operated the ferry told the Union cavalry that she recognized one of the guys that was traveling with Booth, and then the Union cavalry arrests that guy, leads him to Garrett's farm. So that piece, that kind of part of the story, so to speak, is not as well known. So then the Union cavalry surrounds the barn. They tell Booth and Harold that they know they're in there and that they need to come out. And at this point in time, interestingly enough, David Harold wants to surrender. And so he ends up doing so, and him and Booth get in a little bit of an argument, but eventually Harold comes out. He surrenders to the Union authorities. The Union cavalrymen, there was about 24 of them, had surrounded the barn, and it's late at night. And so they're going back and forth, trying to negotiate stuff. And they're telling Booth to come out. He's saying he doesn't want to. And just back and forth, back and forth. And so how is this going to play out? Well, eventually what the Union cavalry decides to do is they're going to light the barn on fire and force Booth out of the barn, was their strategy. Instead of storming it, you think there's a guy inside with a bunch of guns. You could storm the barn, but he's probably going to likely kill some of the people that stormed the barn. So they don't want to necessarily do that unless they have to. They think a better approach is to kind of stay back a little bit in the darkness of the night, and they have somebody sneak up and light the barn on fire, and then Booth will either have to perish in the flames or he'll have to come out, and at which point in time they can confront him there. So that's the plan. This is a great image. It's a well-known image of what happened. The barn is a lot smaller. Oh, let me go back. This is actually not the barn that Booth was in. This is just more of a reproduction. This is a current barn, but it's more kind of indicator of what the barn would have looked like. So it doesn't have windows and stuff like that. But anyway, this is not the exact barn. I forgot to mention that. So Booth's inside. The barn was actually a lot bigger than it's depicted here, but I still really like this illustration of what happened. So they've lit the barn on fire. Now, once they light the barn on fire, it's all lit up inside, and they can see what's going on inside because the barn has slats in between the boards. And so they can see Booth moving around in there. So they know he's in there. They know he's doing something. What he's doing, they're not quite sure. And so the gentleman sees him reaching, he being Booth, one of the soldiers sees Booth reaching for his gun and thinks that they're about ready to get in a gunfight with him, which they don't want to do unless they have to. So one of the soldiers ends up shooting John Wilkes Booth to prevent him from shooting at them, the soldiers, and Booth ends up collapsing. They see that take place, then they go and race inside the barn and drag him out, which is what they're doing here. And then they drag Booth from the barn to the farmhouse and keep him on the porch, and they try and keep him comfortable. He was kind of a little bit responsive, but not all that much. They gave him some water, but eventually he died of his injuries, Booth did, because he was shot in the neck. And the person who shot John Wilkes Booth was this interesting individual, Boston Corbett, known as the man who killed John Wilkes Booth. So again, to go back to this illustration, Corbett actually got closer to the barn than is depicted here. But again, they could see Booth moving around. They thought, well, he's about to do something. There was never a command allegedly given to shoot Booth. This guy just kind of did it on his own, which was somewhat controversial. The preference was to capture Booth alive if they could, but they ended up killing him, and he died on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. And again, the guy who shot him, Boston Corbett, the man who killed John Wilkes Booth. And he, afterwards, he became kind of like a mini celebrity. He got like his 15 minutes of fame. And he was a very interesting and eccentric individual as well. So if you ever get a chance to learn more about him, you should probably do so. And then, so you can actually visit this spot where Booth died. So on this road, 2 miles south is the Garrett place. There, John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin, was found by Union cavalry and killed while resisting arrest on April 26. So this is the sign on the way to Garrett's farm. So it's a couple miles from here, but it's neat to follow this trail and see the signs along the way. And then, okay, this is where it actually took place. It's where all went down. So this was our van that we rented the first time we did this. Here's the historic marker. So there's not a museum at this particular site per se. This is actually a federal government military installation. So I kind of get the impression they don't want a lot of tourists coming here. But that being said, you can still come visit here. It's kind of like a historical pilgrimage site. And so that's what we're doing here. But you can't, there's no like museum at this particular site you can go see like exhibits or anything, or there's no like, you know, Starbucks here where you can get a coffee or something. It's just literally a sign on the side of the road that people stop at. It was funny when I was researching this before I came out here the first time. There's just all these people have made posts on the internet and Facebook and YouTube and stuff of them stopping here. So it's kind of funny just because it's so many people come here, but yet it's not really designed for tourists. They should probably, in my opinion, kind of make like a pull off or something here. So it's a little bit safer, because I mean, listen, you're literally just driving down the road, pull your car over, come out and check this out. And then here you go. And then here's the historical marker. This is the site of Locust Hill, Richard Henry Garrett's farm. Early on the morning of April 26, 1865, a 16th New York Cavalry Detachment cornered John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln, and his co-conspirator David E. Harold, as the two men slept in Garrett's tobacco barn. Harold gave himself up, but Booth refused to surrender because he knew about John Brown. The barn was set on fire, and Sergeant Boston Corbett shot the assassin still inside. Booth was laid on the porch of the Garrett house and died about sunrise. The house and barn stood a short distance from this spot. So this is really all there is to see here. But that being said, it was kind of a nice end of the story to actually come all the way here, because the first time we made this trip and we were planning it, we were trying to debate whether or not we should come all the way down here or not. But if you have the time, it is kind of gives you a sense of kind of I don't know, completion, if you can actually make the journey all the way here to this spot. And then here you can see this morning. So this took place, the shooting in the early hours of April 26, 1865. Booth had been on the run for 12 days after he shot Lincoln. So John Wilkes Booth, he was a famous actor. He was a Southern sympathizer. I have a few more things to go over, so we're not done just yet. I'll give you like kind of a postscript of what happened after Booth was killed. He was an extremist, a racist, and he blamed Lincoln for the South's misery and suffering, as we heard in the quote earlier. All right, so there's a lot more to the story than just that. What were some of the more noteworthy items? So what happened after John Wilkes Booth was killed at Garrett Farm? Well, they took his body back to Washington, D.C. They wanted to make sure it was him. And so that was a big deal. They really did want to capture Booth alive and interrogate him, because they were, at this point in time, they're still not quite sure what actually took place, other than the fact that Lincoln was shot and there was an attempted assassination on Seward. They wanted to interrogate Booth, find out if the Confederate government was involved and what his intentions were, et cetera, et cetera. There was a big interest in capturing him alive if they could. But that being said, when they weren't able to capture him alive, there was a big interest on making sure that the body that they actually got was Booth's. And so they had people that know him identify him. And so they put Booth's body in a wagon and transported it to a ship. And the ship then took it up to Washington, D.C. And so Booth is out of the picture, so no trial for him. There is a big trial that takes place in the days and weeks after the assassination, and four of Booth's co-conspirators were found guilty, including David Harold and Mary Surratt, and then were put to death. And then where did this take place? So this trial that took place, the famous Lincoln conspiracy / assassination trial, took place in Washington, D.C. And it's a site that you can actually go visit. This is also a federal government installation, but it's open to the public periodically. And this is one of the most famous and interesting trials in American history. Now every few years, something is supposedly the trial of the century, but this really was. There had never been a trial like this before, and it'd be a long time before there was a trial like this again. But so really fascinating legal history. Maybe some point in time we can do a program just on the trial itself. But you can actually visit this site. It was really heavily covered in the media and the press, as you can imagine. And it was a military tribunal, it wasn't a civilian trial. And that in and of itself is a little bit controversial, but you can visit this site. So this particular site is not open every single day, but usually a few times throughout the year, they'll open this place up and you can actually come visit here. So if you're in Washington, D.C., you can visit the site of the Booth Conspirators trial site. Booth, of course, himself was not on trial because he was already killed. But pretty neat to go here. And then these are the different members of the military tribunal. There were 9 of them. And so kind of interesting to go back here and see this particular site. So if you're in Washington, D.C., you can just, usually what they've typically done is maybe like 3 or 4 times a year, they'll open the site up to the public. They'll have like an open house and you can come here and visit, ask questions and see stuff. And then here's some media coverage of the trial. So after the trial was over, several members of the conspirator group were found guilty, and then 4 of them were sentenced to death, including David Harold and Mary Surratt. And so these are just some media coverage of the day showing that taking place. And so this was a black and white photo that was colorized. So they built this special scaffolding just for this event. And then they led the 4 individuals up here to the gallows, so to speak. And then this area was heavily guarded during this event. They were a little concerned that maybe someone would try and, I don't know, liberate the prisoners, or there'd be some commotion or something, so to speak. So heavily guarded, thus the guys on the wall surrounding this. And then this next 2 photos are a little bit graphic. So if you're queasy, you might want to turn your head for just a moment. And then the gallows dropped and the 4 prisoners were hung. So apologies for the graphic nature. I did want you to see that. Kind of one of the takeaways here, though, the execution took place on July 7th of 1865. The assassination, Lincoln died on April 15th, but Booth shot him on the night of the 14th. I mean, that's really quick. Notice there's not a lot of time between the hangings and the assassination. It's not like this trial dragged on for weeks and months and years like it probably would now. And what is this site now? Well, ironically enough, the site, this is still this property belongs to the federal government, but the site where the actual hanging took place is now a tennis court of all places. So this gentleman here is holding a blow up of the photo. So this was the photo I just showed you a minute ago, and he's standing, this is a tennis court. So that's interesting that the site of the hanging is now a tennis court. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's 2 great books on the Lincoln assassination and the hunt for Booth and his co-conspirators, and the 2 books that I think are the best. There's a lot of really great books on the Lincoln assassination, but the 2 that I like the best that are related to this kind of hunt for Booth and his men and Mary Surratt, They've Killed Papa Dead by Anthony Pitch and Manhunt by James Swanson. So if you're going to be going on the Booth escape route, you might want to pick up these books and read them beforehand, because I went into a lot of detail, but I really just scratched the surface on the events that took place and what Booth was involved in. And there's just a whole lot more to the story. I really just only had time to give you like the Cliff's Notes. But these 2 books do a really great job of going into all the details. So really recommend picking those up. As I said, at some point in time, I'll be back in Washington, D.C. And if you're in D.C. or want to come for a visit, you can go on our tour of Ford's Theater. Usually what I've done in the past is we've done like a tour like on the outside area surrounding Ford's Theater. So like we go to Mary Surratt's boarding house and see some other sites connected to the assassination, like where Booth, the hotel that he was staying in, and all that kind of stuff. So you can be on the lookout for that. Date is, of course, TBD. This has been our Lincoln Assassination, Conspirators, and Booth Escape Route tour. Our other program, we had like part 1 was the actual assassination itself, and we talked about Ford's Theater. So I'll post both of these programs on our YouTube channel. I had to edit this particular video. There was some problems with it, and I'm still in the process of editing it. So sometimes with these videos, it takes a little bit of time before I can actually post them to our YouTube page, but I do have these recorded, and I'm recording this one. And so I will post them, but it's probably going to take a day or two. So you can keep a lookout for that. If you get a chance, just check out our YouTube channel. It's called Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're up to almost 200 programs on our channel, all different types of historical and cultural topics. You can check that out. And then if you're interested in learning more about the Kennedy assassination, every November we do a program like this that talks about that. And so the program we did on the John F. Kennedy assassination is also on our YouTube channel. So we talked in this particular program about what were the Kennedys doing down in Texas, and how did the assassination take place, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can check that out. And then this November, I actually live in Texas. This November is the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy in November. And so if you are interested and want to come down to Dallas and see some of the sites that are associated with President Kennedy, we'll have opportunity to do that. And then if you can't make it to Dallas, we'll have online or virtual type stuff as well. So I don't have all the details for that because it's so far away, but because it is the 60th anniversary of that very important historical event, the assassination of President Kennedy in November, we'll have a lot of online virtual programs for those of you that aren't in Texas, and a lot of in-person programs for those of you that are in the Big D. We're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. All the programs we do are usually free. If you've ever made a donation to support the work we do, thank you very much. It pays for all of our administrative costs and allows us to continue to offer all these community programs for free. If you ever want to support the work we do, you can do so by PayPal, Venmo, or GoFundMe. And this information is also in the email that was sent out and had the Zoom link. And hey, hopefully at some point in time, either with us or on your own, you'll get a chance to make this really fascinating journey that John Wilkes Booth took from Ford's Theater down to Surratt Tavern and the Dr. Mudd Farm, and et cetera, and then it's culminated down here at Garrett Farm. So it was really interesting. And like I said, hopefully you will get a chance at some point in time to make this journey, because you learn so much more about the assassination and Booth and just what it was like to live during this time when you can actually make this journey physically yourself. I appreciate you joining us in the online virtual version as kind of a starting point. And then, of course, not to be lost with the assassination by Booth is the fact that Abraham Lincoln, our great president, was killed. And so hopefully at some point in time, you also get a chance to visit the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So make sure you check that out as well. All right, well, that is the end of our program. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Abraham Lincoln, born on February 12th, 1809. He was killed on April 15th, 1865. So that's the end of our program. Thank all of you for joining us. If you're watching us live on Zoom, I'll send an email with the link to the recording as soon as I get a chance, or you can just check out our YouTube channel, like I said, Washington, D.C. History and Culture. So have a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.